Good morning.
Good morning.
Okay, try that again. Good morning.
Good morning.
Thank you so much. It is a good morning, and it's a pleasure to be here with you. I want to start by recognizing the fact that this event is taking place on traditional Ohlone land, and that it would not be possible without recognizing the importance of the land to the Ohlone people. So just always important for us to recognize the displacement and to be able to integrate the history of the way that race and racism has played out in our country in order for us to move forward. My name is Julie Nelson, and I am the Senior Vice President of Programs at Race Forward. And it is really a wonderful pleasure to be able to provide the welcome for this particular workshop. The title of the workshop is Operationalizing Belonging Through Democracy. Now, democracy is an interesting word because we talk a lot about democracy, but the reality of what democracy is something that continues to evolve. And the panelists that we have with us today are going to be working with us to give us some examples of what a multiracial, inclusive democracy can be, what it should be, and how we can work towards that. I want to do a little bit of a check to see who's in the room. Would you raise your hand if you work for government? Great. And if you work for a community-based organization? And academia? Private sector? Faith community? Who am I leaving out? Well, we have the Boston Federal Reserve in the room, which I would say your government. Yeah. So anyways, love that we have a mix of people in the room, that for us to actually move the needle on racial inequities, we need to have cross-sector partnerships. So it's wonderful to be having this conversation with such an eclectic group of people in the room. The Race Forward is a national multiracial racial justice organization. And just want to say that this idea of democracy is critical to the work that we do. We know that we are not going to be able to achieve racial equity unless we fundamentally transform government. Those two things are deeply interconnected. And so the approach that we take have 5 core functions. Our work within the institutional and sectoral change slice of our work is around transforming sectors. So changing government. There's other sectors as well, thinking about the private sector, nonprofits, really thinking about how we shift sectors so that we are moving towards racial equity. Policy. We know that policy has created racial inequities, and that policy's got to be a part of changing outcomes as well. Narrative arts and culture, the stories that get told about race, the stories that get perpetuated, and how we can shift those narratives so that we're creating new narratives that are about racial equity rather than perpetuating the status quo. Movement and capacity building, looking at the history of change in the United States, we know that change has always taken place because of grassroots organizing. It's not like institutions woke up one day and said, my bad. We have had change take place because of community organizing, pressuring, forcing government and other institutions to change. So the work that we're doing to, in the grassroots level around building movement, building capacity, really critical for us to get to different outcomes. And then finally, research, thinking about how we can use data to inform what we're doing, how we can do it from a community-based perspective. These 5 functions are really critical for us moving the needle on racial equity. Individual strategies can be effective, but collectively is where they add up. Just a quick word about the Government Alliance on Race and Equity. GARE is a movement within government, a peer-to-peer, membership-led, membership-driven network that was launched about 5 years ago as a national network. Lots of work going on regionally prior to that, but we have grown every single, each of the 5 years, we've doubled in size. Our membership meeting is next week, and the slide says we have 138 members, but it's actually going to be 140 members. Yeah, so we've doubled in size every year, and our goal, like I said, is to transform the entire sector. So changing the expectation that it's not a choice of whether government does or doesn't work on racial equity, but that it is an expectation, that it is the role of government to advance racial equity. So we provide tools to put theory into action, not just talking about research, but actually changing policies, changing practices, changing organizational cultures. So the work that we're doing within government to transform government is a critical part of our sectoral change strategy. So today, that's exactly what we're going to be digging into. Our theory of change recognizes that we have to be able to normalize conversations about race, that if there are environments where it's an elephant in the room, people don't have a shared understanding, some people think that we're just talking about individual acts of bigotry, other people are using terminology like individual racism or institutional racism, structural racism, then we're not going to have a shared conversation because we don't have a shared analysis. So have to be able to normalize conversations about race. The challenge is that sometimes that's where it starts and stops. Organizations will think, oh, we got to send people to training, and then it becomes a check the box activity. We know that's not enough. Have to actually be able to operationalize equity, so change those policies and practices. Change the ways that our organizational cultures are actually operating. The third key component is organizing. So we talk about organizing from an inside-outside perspective. Have to organize inside an institution in partnership with community. That level of accountability between an institution and the community is going to mean that we get more traction more quickly. So that's the overall sort of normalize, operationalize, organize, and that's the introduction to today's workshop. And with that, I will turn it over to Michele Kumi Baer.
Thanks, Julie. Give Julie a hand. Julie's been a part of the brain trust of GARE, and we wouldn't have the network, the membership, the scale that GARE is working at without Julie's work. So thank you so much, Julie. So as Julie said, my name is Michele Kumi Baer. I joined the Race Forward team last summer, and my role is focused on, as Julie's noted, our work organizing government. I'm focused on how this framework works in philanthropy. So just to name that for folks in the room, that's the lens that I'm bringing to our work at Race Forward. So why are we here? Why are we talking about operationalizing belonging? A little bit about me. My name is Michele Kumi Baer. I was born here in the San Francisco Bay Area, the ancestral lands of the Ohlone people. I am a multiracial Asian person. Some folks might call me Hapa. It's a term that's debated in some contexts. Essentially means that I have mixed ancestry, right? Asian on one side of my family and European on the other side. And when I think about belonging in the context of our conversation today, there's so many layers and mixed messages that we've gotten about our country as we entered into this conversation. We're in our welcome and overview today, talking about what it means to come to this space, to think about organizing within government, and to talk about operationalizing belonging within that context. We have to be honest with ourselves and each other that the founding of the United States of America centered the belonging of a certain group of people over others, right? What was that group of people? Cisgender white men who owned property at that time, right? Hetero, thank you. Cishet people, cishet white men. And there was a very convenient concept, convenient for them concept, that Johann Blumenberg, thank you, in Germany, you can if you'd like. Thank you, I appreciate that. Appreciate you. So Johann Blumenberg, do folks in the room, or Blumenbach, sorry, not Blumenberg, Blumenbach. Do folks in the room know what Johann Blumenbach worked on? No? Would someone who knows like to let the room know what that was? He invented the racial hierarchy that we've had Europeans export to this country and around the world through colonialism. That there is this concept of race that we are all categorized into, whether being what he termed Caucasoid or Negroid, Mongoloid, Australoid, and that this hierarchy was exported to allow for settler colonial societies here and elsewhere to organize power and concentrate power and property for white people where they settled. And narratives like Manifest Destiny, which is depicted on the slide above, were central metaphors, central calls to action that accompanied that idea, right? And so we can't talk about why we're here today without acknowledging that reality, that imagery, that importantly a moral call to action, and how that resulted in the displacement and mass genocide of indigenous peoples, the forced migration and enslavement of African peoples, and the organization of people who did not come to call themselves white into that racial hierarchy. And so we inherit stated values and ideals encapsulated in the statements above. For example, all men are created equal, which in itself is explicitly exclusionary, but expresses some amount of equality within its stating, right? What kind of men are we talking about? Again, this is cishet men, white men, who hold property at the time. We also have statements of liberty and justice for all. We have government buy-in for the people. All of these equality-based frames, stated, held culturally, held with throughout our society, do not necessarily manifest, as we know, being in this room, wanting to work on racial equity in government and elsewhere. They do not actually manifest in equality and equitable processes for people of color and indigenous folks on the ground. So that value system and the construct of race that was imported from Europe, we see that manifest in very specific policies and practices. We can note that throughout our history, there's been different manifestations of racism in institutions. Specifically in government, we can look at how historically there was a time when we were very explicitly discriminating. The example up on the slide here actually was something that's affected me personally, in that my family was forcibly incarcerated during World War II through the internment camps that were created for Japanese people. And then there became a time when we decided, the law of the land is now that we do not discriminate on race, and we see a shift in how policies actually manifest. So we come into an era where we have more implicit forms of discrimination, where we can see quote-unquote race-neutral policies, meaning they're not explicitly mentioning race, but we know that they have racially inequitable outcomes. So we'd say here that, well, we're not really talking about something that's race-neutral, it's really race-silent. And what happens when we're race-silent is we're not accounting for race, we're not addressing racism. So fast forward to now. We've seen the cumulative impacts of our history of inequitable policies and practices, and we're trying to course correct. I know the we is not necessarily the huge big tent we, but it is certainly the we in this room, the we that I feel with my colleagues and comrades in this work at Race Forward, the we that I see through friends and colleagues in the room. And as Julie mentioned, we have a movement happening right now to institutionalize racial equity practice, not just in government, but also in community-based organizations, in philanthropy, in faith-based organizations, because we've inherited institutions that were set up to create racial inequities. We've inherited institutions that were set up to maintain racial inequities, and we're trying to course correct. We have a current context now where we've inherited also decades of activism and organizing. We've inherited impacts of that activism and organizing by a shift in who we see in power. People talk about the blue wave last year, but the thing I was most excited about was the women of color wave, right? And we have the return of white nationalists into the Oval Office. Right? That's the reality of our current context. And we also have national conversations happening about race where you have people holding positions of power that don't understand, for example, when we're talking about DNA testing, we're talking about, with the 23andMe's and the Ancestry.coms, we're actually talking about threats to indigenous sovereignty, right? So we're holding a lot of space for the organizers in the room, for the people of color standing in power in the room, but also holding in the room our need for deep learning and accountability to one another, right? So I don't want to belabor this point too much, just to say that we at Race Forward are very much focused on how racial inequity shows up in a variety of contexts, in a variety of systems and structures, which is to say, if you look at any area of our life, collect data on the outcomes that we experience as people and disaggregate that data by race, you would see racially inequitable outcomes. You could also disaggregate that data based on other aspects of identities and other systems of oppression that impact us as people. And you would find in queer communities, amongst women, amongst immigrant communities, you still find disaggregated data by race. You still see that people of color and indigenous people are experiencing the most inequitable outcomes there. So we talk about race in relationship to not only different sectors that we work in, but also to different aspects of our identities. We know that we don't lead one issue lives. We know that we don't lead one sector lives. It's not like I'm Michele today, I'm just an Asian person, and I'm always an Asian person all day. I'm not a woman, not a cisgender woman, not a non-disabled person. It's also not that I'm just Michele here today in a hotel. Right, I'm here Michele today, I'm on the street, I'm interacting with food systems, I'm interacting with workplace systems. All these things are interconnected. And so the interconnection between structures in our lives, between institutions in our lives, between sectors in our lives, that creates what we call structures. And it's that structural interactiveness, that interaction on a daily basis with all these systems and structures that we're constantly in communication with, the racism that exists within those institutions interacting with one another is what creates structural racism. So I want to talk a little bit about that, very specifically before we move on. Something to very deeply get at here that part of what I love about training at Race Forward is that we get to really spend time with people talking about racism and how it manifests in our lives, but we don't always get to talk about some of the less visible aspects of how racism operates. So what we have here is what we call our iceberg of structural racism. And what do we know about icebergs? What happened in Titanic? Unfortunately for Leo and Kate, everyone on the boat tried to course correct. It looked like we were good and we were gonna, swerve to the side of said iceberg, but it was way bigger, way larger, way more massive and crystallized and hardened than they had anticipated. And so the boat underneath the water hit the iceberg. So when we think about structural racism as an iceberg, it's important for us to hold these truths that there are things underneath the surface that are hardened, that are crystallized, that are interconnected, that are working together to hold up this structure of the things that we see on the top. And I just want to name those before we move into our conversations today because they're really important for us to hold. The first thing being culture, right? Everyday norms and things that we take for granted, right? That's why Julie pointed out the first step in our theory of change is normalize. We have to change the culture. So that's a key aspect of the iceberg. The next portion is history. We talked a bit about the cumulative impact of different events in history set up by institutions that were designed to be explicitly and then implicitly racist. And we see the interconnectedness between those policies over time. The last piece of the iceberg that I think is really important for us to hold is ideology. The power of ideas. The power of what Johann Blumenbach created and exported. The power of ideas like the fact that we could be post-racial. The power of an idea of, oh, I'm just colorblind, I don't see color. Ideas are incredibly powerful, and they hold a lot of institutional power and structural power in our lives. So I just want to leave you with one thought, and before we head into how our esteemed colleagues here are working within government to change systems from the inside and from the outside, is that this system was designed this way. Has anyone heard this phrase? Oh, well, the system's not working, it's broken. Folks heard that? No, it's working how it was designed to work. Manifest destiny for whom? Belonging for whom? It was not designed for all of us, right? So we have to talk about building a new way, and I want to leave the floor to my colleagues in working in government to try to reform some of the toughest institutions to work within. Some of the toughest institutions to work within. We're going to head into some short presentations, one from each speaker. And I just want to take a moment to say how thankful I am for our 3 colleagues from the Bay Area who are here. Tracy Zhu has been a member of the Baer family for some time. Tracy's out in San Francisco. And it was actually the fact that there was this movement for racial equity in government that attracted Tracy to actually work in government from the first place. So I just really want to thank Tracy for being here. And Roberto Bedoya is going to speak second in our group. And I just want to thank Roberto. I don't know if he knows this. When I was in grad school, I was super inspired by his work on creative placekeeping and spatial justice. And it inspired me to deepen my work in arts and justice and to go to the Allied Media Conference where I met Roberto and we talked. And so ever since I've been following his work. So I just want to really thank him, 1, for that, 2, for coming to Oakland, and 3, for what he's going to offer to us today. So give Roberto a hand. And last but certainly not least, Darlene Flynn is here in Oakland, having been in Seattle before. And I just really want to honor the Darlenes in the room, those folks who are working more often than not behind the scenes, right, to change institutions from the inside, to support the Tracys and the Robertos of the world who are more directly interfacing with local residents. Darlene is working to create infrastructure in Oakland city government for racial equity. So give it up for Darlene. All right, Tracy, would you like to go first?
Thank you so much. Good morning, everyone. How are you doing? Great. Well, thank you so much for joining us today. Really appreciate your time and energy and understanding how we are in government trying to really advance racial equity in a way that is transformative and institutional and not just transactional. And so I hope today to share a little bit about my experience working at the San Francisco Public Utilities Commission. And I'll talk a little bit more about what the SFPUC does. But just really, really briefly about myself. I grew up in San Francisco in Bayview Hunters Point, and I think a lot of what I've grappled with in my personal and professional career is this kind of sense of belonging and what does kind of home mean to me. Growing up in Bayview, it's a historic Black neighborhood that is increasingly Latino and Asian. And for me, I spent a lot of time in sort of Chinatown, North Beach area, sort of northeast part of San Francisco. And after 32 years living in San Francisco, finally moved out of the city to Oakland. So I appreciate Oakland for welcoming me. But this constant grappling of what does it mean to what does home mean? What's my sense of place? What's my sense of belonging? And I've been really grateful that after a career in nonprofit and philanthropy that I found a sense of place in local government. So happy to share more about my personal story in our small breakout sessions, but want to give you just a sense of where I'm coming from. Hopefully today I'll leave you with some thoughts on how we advance equity through San Francisco's water, wastewater, and public utilities. So what is the San Francisco Public Utilities Commission? Our mission is to provide customers with high quality, efficient, and reliable water, power, and sewer services in a manner that's inclusive of environmental and community interests and that sustains the resources entrusted in our care. Just to kind of pull back the curtain on that a little bit, California's history has been really shaped by our water history and who claims water, who has access to water. And so the city of San Francisco has a long history, 100-year-old history of going up to the Sierras and other parts of the Bay Area on the peninsula and Alameda and claiming water rights, AKA kicking Native American folks off of their indigenous lands and quote unquote claiming these rights for the city and county of San Francisco, which then we've been selling that water to wholesale customers throughout the Bay Area that serve 2.7 million people. And so parts of the peninsula and southern Alameda County also receive water from us. And what does that really mean today? It means that we have a metropolitan area that can only thrive with this access to water. If you didn't have water allocations for example, a development, you would not be able to proceed with that development. If you were industry like the Silicon Valley, that industry really was not able to grow and thrive unless the city and county of San Francisco was selling water to those industries. And so today, what is that opportunity to be able to leverage these investments in infrastructure for racial equity? And these are some of those opportunities. We have over $1 billion operating budget. One of the largest employers in San Francisco with 2,300 employees. And this is in a city and county of San Francisco that employs 30,000 employees. We are on the tail end of a $4.8 billion regional water system improvement program that increased the seismic reliability of our water system from Yosemite all the way to San Francisco. And we're right in the middle of a $6.9 billion sewer system improvement program just in the confines of the 7x7 county of city and county of San Francisco to improve our sewer system that's built 100 years ago, and many pipes are made of brick and is like literally kind of dissolving. We, a few years ago, launched the Clean Power SF program, which by July 1st will be providing 80% of the city's electrical demand. Thank you. We essentially are exercising our rights that was afforded to us by a state law that allows us to auto-enroll all the residential and commercial customers in San Francisco from PG&E, such that we're providing power generation, renewable power from hydro, wind, and other forms of renewable energy, such as geothermal energy from Sonoma for the city's residents and commercial businesses. And so we have a huge opportunity in front of us in what some people might think of sort of the putting the meat on the bones of a Green New Deal, right? So how do we meet our mission? We have two policies on the books that I'm proud to say we're the first utility in the country to have passed these two groundbreaking policies. First utility in the country to have an environmental justice policy that says that we need to reduce, lessen, and prevent disproportionate impact that we have communities across the region. And we have a community benefits policy that directs the PUC to be a good neighbor to all whose lives or neighborhoods are directly affected by our operations, programs, and policies. And you might be asking, why would a water utility need to explicitly have these two policies in the books? And it's because it's not really often talked about within government about our disproportionate impact that we might have on communities. Government thinks of itself as doing good already by providing public services to all. And what we know is that not everyone feels like they can call upon government to respond to their needs. And so, we provide government's good at providing public services like libraries, water, streetlights, and paving streets. But we know that not all communities feel comfortable picking up the phone and complaining about the pothole that's on their street, or even if they do, that they will be responded to. And so the goals of these policies were really to, one, address the disproportionate impact, which is like kind of the EJ side, and ensure that then all the communities we serve are then benefiting, and we know that not all communities benefit. And so this gives us the thrust to be able to really focus on those communities that face disproportionate impact and don't receive all the benefits that it could be from the utility. One thing I do want to call out is that we were only able to really pass this EJ policy because of what Julie and Michele alluded to earlier, which is the organizing from the community, especially from communities like Bayview Hunters Point, the neighborhood I grew up in. And it's particularly women of color like Karen Pierce and Espanola Jackson and Marie Harrison who really led the charge around environmental justice for us to have that community cover to be able to, for our commission to adopt this policy. So how do we operationalize that at the PUC? These two policies laid out 10 outcomes that we want to be to work towards. The highlights of those 10 outcomes really fall in these 5 program areas: education, arts, workforce and economic development, environmental justice and land use, and neighborhood revitalization. We approach each of these program areas through these values with equity, inclusion, authentic stakeholder engagement, and leverage partnerships. And what I hope to do in the last few minutes is to just give you 2 examples of how we're really advancing environmental justice and through the lens of leveraged partnerships. So first, around environmental justice. So this is the key example of environmental justice that personally impacted my life. I grew up 10 minutes away from our biodigesters facilities project at the Southeast Treatment Plant. This treatment plant treats 80% of the city's sewage, and so if you've ever sat in downtown or in the Mission or at Westfield Mall and you flush the toilet, that sewage goes rushing, down an underground stream through our pipes to the Southeast Treatment Plant, again, to Baby Hunter's Point, where over 90% of the people who live there are people of color. It's still one of the more affordable parts of San Francisco, and just has a long history of also environmental racism and exclusion. And so you can see literally across the street, less than 100 meters away, is residential neighborhoods. And so there's this incompatible land use of industry and residential side by side. And so one of the things that our agency was really committed to as we were making plans for investing over $2 billion of that $6.8 billion of infrastructure investment in the Southeast Treatment Plant alone. It's a once in a lifetime infrastructure investment where we're planning on rebuilding this treatment plant to last not just the next decade, but the next 40, 50, 60 years, so that our children and our grandchildren are still using kind of the same system. With this once-in-a-lifetime infrastructure investment, we wanted to make sure that we got it right. And so one of the things that we did as part of the environmental impact report, which people here may or may not be familiar with, is that as we're analyzing the environmental impacts around air pollution, around traffic, we made the case to our leadership that we needed to also create and do an environmental justice analysis. And what does that mean? The EIR, or Environmental Impact Report, again, measures the impacts that we have on the birds and the bees, and again, so the environment. But that we knew that when community came to us and talked about the potential impacts of a large infrastructure investment, they would also want to talk about the socio-economic impacts. Are we improving this facility to the point that it would increase property values and displace them from the neighborhood? And so who were we really improving this treatment plant for? And so in order to capture all that feedback around the socio-economic impacts, we did an environmental justice analysis to really catalog that feedback that we're getting from the community. And so there were recommendations out of both the EIR and the EJ analysis that we could address directly with the project. So for example, the new facility would continue to emit some level of particulate matter, specifically PM 2.5, that is a type of air pollution. It would be less than what our current facility would be emitting if we did not do the upgrade, but it was still more than what what the state level standards would allow. And so we were able to make the case with our environmental justice policy that we, even though we're not going to be exceeding state standards, that we should continue to reduce and lessen our impact on this neighborhood that's already disproportionately impacted by 2 freeways that cut through the neighborhood, the various industrial facilities and the truck depots that are located in this neighborhood. And so there are things that the project can go above and beyond. In addition, now we have a report, the EJ analysis, that says there's disproportionate impact in this neighborhood that may or may not be caused by us, but that impacts low birth weight. In terms of outcomes around low birth rate, there's higher rates of unemployment in this neighborhood. There's a higher rate of people's income that's going towards housing, and there's all these various socioeconomic factors that are disproportionately burdening people in this neighborhood. So by having this report, we can share that report with our partners such that, you know, if the water utility, for example, can't invest in efforts to reduce displacement, then our partners can. And so this is where I want to then talk about how we're leveraging partnerships through our Social Impact Partnership Program, which is the program that I manage. We are the first utility in the nation with an innovative contracting mechanism in which we've been integrating community benefits into our contracting. So we've asked our contractors to go kind of above and beyond what the city and county of San Francisco contract rules require, and that city and county of San Francisco already has really strong contracting rules around local hire and local business enterprises. And so we're asking contractors to really think through what is their corporate social responsibility to the neighborhoods that they will be working in. To date, we have 69 professional services, alternative delivery, and energy procurement contracts in which we've generated nearly $33.8 million in direct financial contributions, volunteer hours, and in-kind donations for schools and nonprofits from 2011 to 2032. And this is all resources directly coming from our contractors. And these are typically architecture, engineering, and construction management firms. And so these are partnerships that I manage with our contractors such that the contributions that they're making in community are meaningful, impactful, measurable, and it's part of my role to hold them accountable. And so I'll leave you all with just some really quick examples of internships that we've specifically targeted towards young people in Southeast San Francisco, such that they are receiving experiences in private firms in architecture, engineering, construction management, and related utility careers. Because we are a regional agency, we have asked our contractors who get contracts throughout our region to do community benefits in those areas that they're working. And so one of our contractors has been supporting a water equity education campaign led by Youth of Color at Youth United for Community Action. Thanks for the props, I'll let them know, to create awareness about the history of East Palo Alto and why they get 100% of their water from SFPUC, and that their vulnerability because they only have that one source. And lastly, in the rural region, where 80% of our water comes from in Tuolumne County, we've really invested in pre-apprenticeship construction training programs, really targeting at women and local residents with barriers to the workforce, such as those who have been formerly incarcerated. And so those are just some really quick highlights of some of the targeted outreach and partnership opportunities to really get at the racial equity on the ground for individuals in transforming their lives. So I'll leave you guys with that.
Good morning. I want to thank the organizers for inviting me here. I'm having a bad sinus day, so my ears are plugged. So forgive me if I don't hear you or whatever, or I get lost in my thoughts. I really going to talk a little bit about the cultural plan as a story that I want to share with you about how do you operationalize belonging. Oh, how does this work? No, this way? That's me, and this is my cultural plan, which was finally released, adopted by Baer and Council in the summer. So I'll talk a little bit about this, but a couple of different things have been running through my head through this process. And so this panel is, called Operationalizing Belonging Through Democracy. And I said, oh, democracy, that's a really slippery word. And what do we mean by democracy? Do we mean sort of representational democracy? You vote and somebody's elected and they represent you, or direct democracy where you're sitting in a circle and you vote and the results are in? Or in a case of planning, how do you plan how do you create a plan that's grounded in what I would call deliberative democracy, that you listen and you look and you listen, and you have the stakeholder community define an action agenda. So in many ways, I love the notion of deliberative democracy, and I consider my job is, in a way, to be a deliberative practitioner. Now, we can go into all that theory stuff about what that means, but that's I need to put that there. So in many ways, this is confusing me. I just want to shout out, I'm going to go through these slides very quickly. I just want to give a shout out to my colleague, Vanessa Wang. I don't know if she's in the room, but she was the consultant I really worked on developing this plan. The plan, Oakland hadn't done a plan in 30 years, so I was being hired, and I've been here almost 2 years now, so I figured, and I was lucky enough to be able to secure some resources to do a plan, so that subsequently informed my process. And so in many ways, the plan unfolded with, and my colleague Darlene just stepped away, but with a really good sense of understanding racial equity and the city's commitment to advance equity in its activities. That's the view outside my office window. I'm lucky. I get to hear all the protests every once or twice a week. You know, it's alive. We did many activities, interviews, engagement. This is sort of a brief sort of things here. This is an example of the community meetings. I'm going to stop here for a moment to also circle back to a thought that I had earlier today about this conference, other than belonging. I kept finding myself sort of feeling uncomfortable in my body, because I feel like sometimes we don't make the distinction between when we're talking about the sociology of belonging or the psychology of belonging. As a government agency, I deal with the sociology. What are the systems that other? Now, I know that some of my grant making deal with artists who are working with traumas, whatever that trauma may be, racism, sexual abuse, and in many ways they're rubbing up against the psychology of belonging. But I need to position my organization, my division, involved in the sociology. But I think we get really blurry here when we use the language of belonging, and we don't really gotta push it. It's like, what are you talking about? I am not your shrink, but I can empathize with your pain. But I also am a part of a government agency, and government is bureaucratic and cumbersome and irritating and frustrating, but it has a certain power and it has a certain capacity to move the dial. So what it means when you're doing system change, grounded in an ethos of belonging. So I just need to say that now. So we did all this community meetings, many locations. Example of those that are in Oakland maybe know these venues. A good question. How many of you are cultural workers, work in the field of culture? Just raise your hand. Great. And how many are you are planners? Just curious to know. Oh, good. And how many are you hardcore policy wonks? Okay. So we're making arguments, in many ways, through art, through planning, through policy making. None of these things are really big aha moments. Oakland was really concerned about this is in reality somewhat of a poor city. I give out like about 1.5 million. San Francisco gives out 12. So, I joke with my San Francisco colleagues and I say, can Oakland be a cultural district of San Francisco, and can I get $3 million?
Yes.
They laugh. I'm glad that they laugh. So, examples of my community. I just wanted to talk about, this was sort of really important to us, these principles, and we kept talking about them throughout the process. Equity is the driving force behind this whole process of creating the plan. culture as a frame, so we kept talking about culture. And we really leaned into culture as the ways of communities, ways of neighborhood identity, the ways people, Oaklanders, define themselves, and not so much exclusively in art and arts organizations. Belonging is the goal. How do we create a city? How do I craft a civic narrative, belonging? And I think I've been really lucky that I have a mayor and a council that really sort of supports this prompting and trying to, we're not the Big Apple. We'll never, how cities love to identify their identity through marketing. Well, we're going to call it, we're the city of belonging. Boy, that's going to be interesting. Oakland, the clenched fist town. I love that about my town. So anyway, we defined cultural equity, and this was really interesting. It's long-winded and good. I'm not going to say to you here, but only to sort of say that I'm ready to do the rewrite already, and to foreground racial equity. But you have to understand that in a city where, I have a very active disability rights movement, I have a very active, feminist movement. So cultural equity needs to hold kind of those articulations. These are, these are the things that we employed in order to move forward. So these are the domains of work. I put my timer on here, so I got 3 more minutes. I'm gonna go a little bit more. So cultural spaces to deal with the anxiety that people have in this city around gentrification and changing demographics, and what does that mean for the spaces, for our arts organizations, neighborhood identity, changing neighborhood, culture in the civic commons, and by that I mean not just public art, but also festival culture, kind of the DIY pop-up spaces that happen all the time. How do I strengthen my own ecosystem? How do I strengthen the ecosystem for culture? And I only would sort of say that one of the outcomes of the plan is this focus on creating a community of implementers, meaning that I can't do it all. I need to do it in partnership with my local philanthropic community, and I have some buy-in, and build the cultural equity build the infrastructure for cultural equity, to do the data gathering that I want. This was adopted. I said, I just want to end with 2 examples of, and this will be my last slide, of 2 projects that we've just launched. One is Neighborhood Voice, which is basically, we're going to fund 8 projects in various neighborhoods throughout Oakland, in which an artist and an NGO, a non-arts group, come together to deal with a community knot. And that one of the anxieties that we kept hearing throughout the deliberation process was this feeling that I don't belong, things are changing too fast, what do I do? I'm anxious. And one of the ways, our resolution is that one way to deal with sort of these anxieties is to strengthen social bonds and social networks. And so this is aimed to do that. I can talk later about the kinds of projects, refugee communities, new immigrant communities, work in deep East Oakland, which is way, that way. And then cultural strategists in government. I have 7 artists, cultural workers who will be working in 5 different departments of the city to deal with sort of, if one of the remedies to move forward and create belonging is to be intersectional, what does that mean? That when you have an artist in the Department of Transportation who's thinking about the built environment and thinking about movement through the city. And the artists are not sort of there for beautification. They're a thought partner in how my colleagues are trying to address belonging in their own divisions of government. And on that note, I'm going to end and give it to my colleague in crime, Darlene.
Nice job. Hello. No, this is fine. I've got a pretty good projection, so I can use this mic just fine. It's great to be here today. I want to thank Roberto for being here today. He is my colleague and co-conspirator around culture and arts. And as a matter of fact, the Department of Race and Equity at the City of Oakland is going to take advantage of his cultural strategist program, and we are going to have an embedded artist in our department doing a cultural project with us this year, focused on anti-Black racism. So it's very exciting for us to have access to those resources as we move through the work of organizing for change in the City of Oakland. You will have to pardon my voice and my clearing of throat. The allergy season is upon us here in Oakland, California, if you haven't noticed. We're all sniffling a little bit, so I'll muscle through. A little bit about me. I am originally from Seattle, Washington. I'm a recent transplant. I've only been here in the Bay Area about 2.5 years, going on 3 years. And Seattle is the only other city that I've lived in for any extended period of time. I was, however, born in Seattle, Washington because of structural racism. My mother is white, or was white, she's deceased now, but my mother was white and my father was Black. And they met in St. Louis, Missouri, and had a secret relationship for a while. And when they decided they were going to actually join forces on a long-term basis, they had to get out. And they came to Seattle. Washington State is one of the 3 states in the Union that did not outlaw interracial marriage, not because Washington was progressive. I know that's probably what you're thinking. But way back then, when all that was going on, what they were was libertarian. And there weren't very many women in the Wild, Wild West. And so many of the men who had come to settle the Pacific Northwest, obviously wanted to have access to whatever women were there. So the driving force behind this apparently progressive stance of the state of Washington was actually self-interest. And therefore, however, later my parents were able to take advantage of that and locate their family and raise their family in Seattle, Washington. So it all turned out okay. And because of that, I have to say that my mixed race identity has always made race extremely salient for me in a particular way. Race is always salient and it always matters. I'm going to talk more about that in a minute. But for me particularly, living with a foot in 2 worlds, being raised by a white mother, the first person I ever fell in love with was a white woman. And yet, wearing this identity throughout my life, which is clearly not white, which means I'm clearly not having my mother's experience, sets up an interesting tension, right? I was also very, very close to my father and my Black grandmother. My Black grandmother rescued my hair, right? From my white mother, to whom I was very close and loved very much, no diss intended, right? But my Black grandmother taught me so much about being Black, so much more than what to do with my hair. Spending every Saturday morning with her while she worked with my hair. To keep it healthy and strong and protected and make sure that nobody ever put a hot comb in it. So that's enough about me, just so you know a little bit about who I am. I was also supposed to be on this panel, I think the person that talked about cannabis. And I have a friendly enough relationship with cannabis, particularly now that I'm aging and have chronic pain in a lot of my joints. Okay, you're following me, right? But I'm not actually the cannabis expert from the City of Oakland. A very fine man named Greg Miner is the man who administers the program and who co-authored the racial equity impact analysis that led to the first cannabis equity program in the nation. And we are very proud of that work that we did together. So I do get fairly strongly identified with cannabis. It was the first headline sort of thing that I got to work on when I got to Oakland. And so I sometimes do talk about what we did with cannabis. But what I'm really going to talk about is how that work that we did with cannabis and some other really impactful work that's going on in the City of Oakland, which I'll hit on at the end, how that is framed up with a larger picture, a larger purpose, a larger mission. And I think this is very, very important because while these quick wins, that's what I call them, quick wins where we can make a difference on the ground now in communities like Bayview, Hunter Point, and other locations in the Bay Area and across the nation are very, very important in people's life. What really matters is that we somehow or another convert those quick wins, those short-term gains that we are making in equity into system transformation. We have got to think bigger than those individual programs, policies, legislative steps that we're taking that are definitely what we're using to build up our stamina, our understanding, our intellectual ability and capacity to hold race and racism in all of its aspects at the institutional level. All of those moments are moments for us to stretch and expand and move toward, at some time in the future, a tipping point where we experience major cultural and organizational change that shows up not only in our policies, practices, and procedures, but in our culture, in our power sharing models, in our inclusion at a level that goes beyond diversity. And it means that people that are most impacted by racial disparities across our nation are actually involved in deciding and determining how those things are going to be addressed, and how the solutions are designed, and how and who implements those solutions as we move forward to a different kind of society, because that is what we need. Anything short of that is less than complete, and that is going to take a while. So that's why we celebrate and highlight things like the Equity Cannabis Program in the city of Oakland, now being replicated across California and in other locations as well. We can celebrate that we made a difference in people's lives, and we can measure the impact that that has. But that is just the beginning of the story, not the end. So I want to talk a little bit more about the framework that we're using to change our democracy. That's one way of thinking about it. I don't usually have this heading on this slide, but I did tweak it to fit into the theme today. And it is exactly what we're doing. I was able to change it because this is what we're doing when we work within government. Government is where our democratic processes manifest most saliently. So we are working to change democracy and to make it just. We've been working on the grand experiment of democracy as the U.S. is doing it for a long time now, and it has never been just. That's already been touched on this morning. So we have to look at this idea of the arc of the moral universe bending toward justice over time, and recognizing that it does not bend on its own. And the best way to bend the arc of the moral universe is through organizing. And community has shown us how to organize for change. And much of what we do inside institutions in this governmental movement is modeled after what community has invented, what community has perfected, and what community has over time been successful at with regard to creating major tipping points in social change. And taking that work and that initiative, when the community invites us to create these kinds of opportunities inside of institutions by pressuring those institutions to do so, we can then use many of the models that have been perfected in community, adapted, of course, for institutional settings, because you have to make things fit, you have to make things work so that people inside the institution can get on board. It's all a strategy. It is not really about doing anything different, except it may look different or sound a little different because we are presenting to a different audience, and we are using different methods of persuasion to get people to move and to change. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about that. This is actually a slide I borrowed from Baer. I think it's a really important backdrop to the work that we're doing to understand that this nation and our cities, county states, and ourselves, for that matter, are on a developmental pathway. When I entered the workplace quite a while ago now, it was all about diversifying the workplace, including women and people of color in locations where they had not previously had access because of overtly discriminatory laws and practices. And we worked with that for a while, and then once we got a little bit more diverse, we realized that we still had inclusion issues, and we had to work on the quality of the experience of folks like myself who had come into the workplace, and we had to enrich participation across identities and cultures. So first we were focused on differences, then we were focused on participation across identities, and now we're looking toward and living into this next phase of development for this country, which is looking at how do we build on what's come before, by focusing on policies, practices, and procedures to ensure equitable outcomes, which is another fancy way of saying justice, right? Fairness. True access for all to the resources of this society. One of the things that we're using here in Oakland, and this is actually additive since I left Seattle, where I did my first work around this institutional change activity was we've added some working assumptions because it jumpstarts people's understanding in a fairly non-threatening way of what it is that we're up to. It's out front, it uses racialized languages, or it talks about race in a very upfront way, using words that have been developed actually through some research by the Annie E. Casey Foundation around working assumptions and getting us out of our old way of thinking. Out of the box. It's difficult because we are heavily programmed, heavily socialized into thinking about race and racial inequity in a particular way that is not helpful, that does not move us toward equity. So we want to start rattling that right away. So anytime I do a presentation on our work, I present these assumptions, no matter who's in the audience, because I think this is a good place to start with people that may not have thought about this before. So the working assumptions are race matters. That's the first one. Race matters. Race always matters. Race matters in its intersectionality with other identities. Race matters standing alone on its own. Race just matters. Almost every indicator of well-being shows troubling disparities by race. So right away we bring in data. That's a reference to data. We can measure how race matters through our inequitable outcomes in this nation. The second one is disparities are often created and maintained inadvertently through policies and practices that contain barriers to opportunities. John Powell's work, I think, is very foundational to this statement. I don't know, I haven't traced the history, but I've worked with John's opportunity maps and the idea of connecting disparities and outcomes with opportunity that is inscribed in geography. And so we can see how those policies were maintained and applied geographically to deepen disparities and maintain those disparities over time. The third bulletin is it's possible and only possible to close equity gaps by using strategies determined through an intentional focus on race. It's pretty simple. If we don't focus on one of the root causes of the disparities, we're not going to be able to address that thing. We must focus on it. It's not the only thing we focus on, but if we ignore it, it will continue to undo our best intentions as we move forward. The next one is if opportunities in all key areas of well-being are equitable, then equitable results will follow. This is a simple logic statement, and it's pretty hard to argue with. Opportunity in, equity out. Lack of opportunity in, inequity out. So we focus on that as well in our measurements and in thinking about how to bring about change. And then the final one is, given the right message, analysis, and tools, people will work toward racial equity. And I always make a little bit of a joke here, and I say, now some of you in the room may be thinking about somebody you know that won't be doing that. Or there may even be somebody in the room that's saying, not me. I'm too busy, I have other things on my mind, it's too hard, it's too scary, I don't want to talk about race. Who knows what this brings up for you? But here's what we know, is that this is actually a true statement. That if you give people what they need to address racial disparities in this country, some people will rally. They will join you. They will become part of the movement and work toward racial equity. Many people are frozen in place because they don't have the tools to do anything about it. And they've been socialized to believe that we're stuck with this and that there's no answer and that it can't be fixed. And so there's a lot of work we can do around this last bullet to bring more people into the conversation by simply giving them the information and the tools and the analysis that they need in order to address what people already know is a horrendous problem in our country. So this is really my work. This is what I do. This last bullet is what I get up in the morning every day to do across the city of Oakland. I work with all city departments. I don't actually have any content expertise in any departmental area, particularly in the city of Oakland. In Seattle, I worked in a few departments before I came to this work. But in Oakland, this is the only work I've done. So I work through and with the departments to think about how to apply these tools and what we need to be working on. And that is what I get to do in my day-to-day work. And it's pretty exciting, and I'm pretty grateful to be doing it. The other thing about this work that we're doing, in order to be transformational, is that we must be system-focused. Systems produce certain outcomes as a result of their design. And, it's already been shared that the system was designed this way. And that's a good thing to understand, because if we really get that, that means that we can redesign the system and get different outcomes. This is actually, even though school-to-prison pipeline is heartbreaking and needs to be taken very, very seriously, this is a system that was built this way. And this is our turn. I think this is the time when I'll say this. This is one of my key messages. Most of this mess got put into place before any of us were here. And we inherited, we were socialized into it. We collude with it. We sometimes challenge it. We are part of it. We are in it. We are immersed in it. We're swimming in it. The key is to recognize that and to recognize how we are part of these systems and what we can do about them. And that's actually just us writing on our page of history. We can leave it the way it is, or we can write a different outcome. Other people created this legacy that we inherited. We're creating the legacy that the next generation will inherit. So what's it going to be? It's as simple as that. Again, I'm going to just touch on this need to address inequity that is inscribed in geography. And not only do we need to address it, but it helps us understand inequity if we understand the legacy of redlining and how redlining has been used to segregate our society and to inscribe inequity very, very deeply in our cities. So if you work in an urban center, this is relevant to your work, or if you live in an urban center, this is relevant to your life. That what redlining did is far more impactful than we can take in from just looking at the redlining map of this area of the Bay. I strongly recommend The Color of Law to all of you. If you care about equity, read it, listen to it on audiobook. It will help you understand this map in a whole new and a whole different way. And it's very, very important that we understand it and how it is salient today. So due to time, that's as much as I'm going to say about that. The other thing, of course, is this data-driven idea that we want to use data to guide investigation of root causes and targeted action that will address those root causes, and we want to do that collaboratively with the communities that are most impacted by these disparities. Some of you may know that the Department of Race and Equity got to lead a project to put together equity indicators for the city of Oakland that was released last June. We are now in the process of working on the update of that report with the City University of New York. It'll be our first update. The equity indicators are designed to provide change scores over time. This is just one of the indicators that we used in the indicator report. I pulled different ones for different presentations. This one is particularly poignant to me. This one touches my heart in a particular way. If any of you in the room have ever experienced asthma or been near people experience asthma, there is nothing like a child. I mean, these are emergency room visits is what's being measured here. So these are emergency asthma events, and there is nothing like being with a child who cannot breathe. There is nothing like the panic that child feels, that their parent feels, the stress involved in it. I mean, this is about breathing. You can't get more basic than that. And so this slide moves me when we can see the differential in outcomes for African Americans, particularly in children's emergency room visits for treatment of asthma. And I want to direct your attention to an article that came out in The Guardian on April 4th. How many people have seen it about air quality and asthma? Hi, Jackie. Jackie's my colleague at the City of Oakland. The title of it is Asthma Alley, Why Minorities Bear Burdens of Pollution and Inequity Caused by White People. Now, I don't do a lot of blame and shame in my work because I don't find that blame and shame is a good way to convert people or bring people in. It also tends to paralyze people. But I think it's worth thinking about some of the content of this article because some of our choices, our day-to-day life choices, are driving these outcomes in communities of color. Because inevitably, this pollution of transporting goods and services on our freeways will be disproportionately impacting communities of color. Here in Oakland, we have two major freeways that run north to south through the city, 580, and I'm going to get this wrong. I think it's 880. And because we also have a little connector 980, but 880 and 580. And one of them runs closer to the hills, which is where the white middle class and upper class people now reside. And the other one runs through more the industrial and the flats, what we call the flats here, where people of color are concentrated. And trucks are not permitted on the upper freeway. They are illegal. They cannot go through even the edge of neighborhoods that are populated by people with privilege. They all go through the flats. And what that causes is not only that the trucks are running through there, but at certain times of the day, the trucks are filling and choking that road and idling for a couple of hours every day. They crawl through the flats. They don't just drive through the flats. So when I see this headline, it means something to me and to Oakland, and it talks about how we have to collaborate because the city of Oakland didn't directly make the decision, all these decisions, didn't directly make them, but we stood up for them, we agreed with them, we helped implement them, and we have a role to play in fixing this. And this is our Oakland data, but this happens to be about New York. This happens to be about the Bronx. What's that? The article is? Oh, I'm so sorry. It's The Guardian. I thought I said that. And the article is called Asthma Alley. Asthma Alley, Why Minorities Bear Burden of Pollution and Inequity Caused by White People. And it's really caused by the affluence of white people and the ability to drive commerce and then place the impacts of that commerce on somebody else, right? So good thing to think about. So when we're doing this work, because we're thinking not only about the immediate programs that are being implemented like the ones we heard about earlier, we're also thinking about changing systems. So we want to use data and community engagement to increase awareness of racial inequity, its root causes, and how it is perpetuated by institutions and systems. And this article in The Guardian does a good job of stirring that up. We want to mobilize, and in my case, I'm mobilizing internally. I'm letting the community mobilize externally, and we're trying to be accountable in our mobilization and also in alignment in our mobilization as much as possible. But internally mobilize advocates to organize support for achieving a shared vision of racial equity. This means we need to train staff, we need to train people to use equity tools and community engagement tools and equity impact analysis to formulate and implement racial equity outcomes. Those are desired future conditions where we won't have these inequities. We're not taught to do that in planning school. I've worked with enough planners to be able to say that quite surely. We don't learn that at any school. Lawyers don't learn it very well. Nobody learns it very well. So people with a lot of power and a lot of say about how our cities are being planned and evolve don't get taught how to do this, so we have to supplement their learning. They were taught tools that will be useful, but only if they're used with a racial equity overlay. Then we want to apply learning from the tools and practice to change policies, practices, and procedures, all those P's, and advance institutional transformation and justice. Not just change the policy, but change who we are. We want to change at the inside level, how we think about and see the world. We want to establish targets and benchmarks and processes to track and report outcomes. Those short-term wins are very important so we don't get fatigued from the length of time that it takes to actually get to a tipping point and transformation. And then we know we're going to have to collaborate with community and other institutions and partners to identify and address cumulative impacts of institutional and structural racism and inequity in Oakland and everywhere else. Oakland's not different. So these is an overview, a high-level overview of our theory of change. We also use equity impact analysis approaches to designing programs, policies, and procedures. I think this is going to be made available to you. I'm not going to go over every point of it. The point to notice is that in order to create an equitable policy or program, you need to take some very specific steps. We are not capable at this point in our evolution of our good intentions carrying us through. They just don't. There are too many things built into the systems and the structures that get in our way. So if we're going to overcome those barriers, we are very intentional about how we approach policy development. And this is often referred to as using a tool or a toolkit. This is nothing new up here. This is extracted from Seattle and Race Forward and Green Lining, and it's the work. It's the work that's going on across the nation. We are building skills and infrastructure in Oakland by setting up equity teams in our departments, by training them through something we call the Race and Equity Academy. It's a 4-part series that accomplishes very much the same work that the Baer Institute accomplishes, but we're doing it internally because I have the same origins as Baer, Seattle, Washington. We're able to do it internally, which is very helpful and cost-effective. Plus, I'm there after the training is over for people to consult with. This is a really good model if your organization or institution is ready to bring this work in-house and to staff it up. That's me. It's been staffed up internally in the city of Oakland, right? That doesn't happen everywhere, and sometimes we have to then use different kinds of strategies to lift it up. But I think that it really makes a difference when a department like the Department of Race and Equity is embedded in the city structure at a high enough place that we can move this work forward with the greatest expediency. So that's just an org chart there. It's not very easy to read, but all of our departments are working on standing up equity teams that are like my franchise operations that I get to work with, because every department has a different culture, has different challenges, business, has different line of work. I can't be an expert in all those areas and how to apply the tools in all those areas. So these equity teams provide me with linkage, and they also become advocates at the local level, eyes on the work, that sort of thing. They become technical resources for their department over time as we train them up and support them to use the tools. So it's a very organizing kind of strategy, as you can, I'm sure, see very clearly. This is internal organizing, but it takes both the structural infrastructure of equity teams and the capacity building to make sure that we're not just saying the words, but that we're doing something different. So we need both. I'm almost done here. So in Oakland, we've had some actions that have been very specifically focused on equity outcomes and using a racial equity framework and tools. And the cannabis slide is there. You can see the leaf. That's how you know what that is. Our downtown specific plan has been now put through a pretty exhaustive equity process. The first time they came out, it blew up and failed. So they went back to the drawing board. And I got to participate in that retooling, and it's now out in draft, and it's made such a difference in the discourse about the draft this time versus the first time. We are really having a meaningful conversation about what was well covered and what wasn't, or what needs more work, but it's rational because it's backed by theory, by analysis, by data, and we can talk about that. Repave Oakland just got released and is really hitting the news right now. If you want to hear some interesting discourse at the Oakland city level, you can look for the Oakland paving plan online, and you'll find several articles, because we're redirecting resources proportionately and based on data to the flats of the city of Oakland. Yeah, we are. Yeah. It's very exciting. This might be the most concrete thing that has happened so far. No joke, no pun intended. It's actually asphalt more than concrete, but this is really real and meaningful, and people are very excited about it. But some people are less excited about it because they're not able to advocate for in the same way, getting to the front of the line when the data doesn't support that. So there's been a very lively conversation. We issued a Let's Bike Oakland bike plan. Every city pretty much needs to have a bike plan now in order to get their hands on transportation money related to biking. So we applied a bunch of race and equity theory to the development of the plan, and if you take a look at it online, you will see that race and equity and data are in it. And that has never happened in a bike plan that I know of before, including disparities in stops on bikes for African Americans in the city of Oakland as a deterrent to biking. Who knew? Except it was right there in the data, and also in the anecdotal stories. I think that's all I've got. The capital improvement program. This is just starting to come out. We were able to design a very innovative approach to rating and ranking projects for the capital improvement that has not been done before across the nation. I think it's going to be a model. It will also challenge that issue of allocation of resources because equity was centered. So this is some of the stuff that's going on right now in Oakland that is tangible and that we can celebrate. We're also working on setting up better measurements. You can find that in our economic development strategy update report that just came out, some concrete and specific goals and outcomes that have been set for economic development in Oakland, and of course the Oakland equity indicators are part of that work as we track over time how we move the needle on racial disparities. So I just want to end by saying equity outcomes describe justice. So if you haven't figured out whether or not your equity outcome statement, which people struggle with, so hard, and it's not that hard, but it's a new thing to start with an outcome and work backwards from that. That's our theory. Equity outcomes describe justice. And if your equity outcome statement is not describing justice, you're not there yet. So here's an equity outcome statement. All residents of Oakland experiencing economic security and living in healthy, vibrant, thriving communities. And the key word there is all. And then if you look at the equity indicators, you can see which communities are not benefiting from the resources of the city of Oakland in that way, and you start to work to change that. So this is that targeted universalism set up in this statement, but it is describing justice because it includes all. And in our work, we'll make sure that we talk to everyone, that we look at everyone's outcomes, and that we center those who are most marginalized in relationship to this outcome. Does that make sense? It's as easy as that. Thank you so much.
As fate would have it, we have 5 minutes to do everything else we wanted to do today, and I am neither a super person nor a time bender, so we're going to instead switch into taking lovely questions that folks offer today, some of which are very technical in nature, and some which are very philosophical, if you will, in nature. There were questions about what is the difference between equity and justice, because they're often used interchangeably, and we could potentially talk a bit about that. I do want to get to some of the more tactical questions, the folks who are asking for insights on practice, right? Because the theme of today is operationalizing. How do we actually get down and do this work? And myself and Julia are more than happy to stay back and answer some of the other questions that came up. And I think our three panelists, too, are more than happy. I'm getting some nods to stay back and answer some of the more technical questions, like, for example, what was it exactly in the environmental justice impact assessment that Tracy, for example, was talking about. So we've passed around some of the cards that our panelists are reading right now, and I wonder if we start first with one question that came up for Roberto around the cultural plan. Would you mind, Roberto, reading the question that came up for you?
Sure. What?
And answering it, of course.
Oh, yeah. Please describe actual community engagement plans, how inputs from flatlands and hills communities balanced and negotiated. What did power sharing look like in this process? It was a quick window that we did the plan started in August and ended in less than a year. We got the money, we went out the door. We had 14 community meetings. Some of them were focused very specifically talking to artists. Some were focused on just general public, like in the library and Diamond Library. We moved throughout every district. We partnered with the East Oakland Boxing Association so that we make sure that we got to Deep East. We had an online survey. We interviewed 60 to 75 community leaders from throughout the city. Throughout this whole process, it's inevitable that people feel left out, and they let me know, which is good, because, I feel like I'm here to hear, so I'm glad that in some ways the process opened the door to communications. So ultimately, the draft was created, the draft was sent out to all the participants, they had an opportunity to feedback. So we're considering our bandwidth and the time frame. We were deliberate of trying to create many, many opportunities for reflection and development of the plan.
Darlene, I want to give you a moment because you had a lot of cards to read a few. Tracy, you had a lot more technical questions, but also some things about specifically how, knowing that we have a lot of different communities in the room, folks who represent different kinds of constituencies that are organizing outside of government. Tracy, there was a question for you about how folks in the room can be helpful instigators outside government to push for the kinds of goals that the Public Utilities Commission is pushing for, or other goals rather, just helpful outside organizing strategies that folks in the room can take up.
Really appreciate that question, especially because I came from the outside and I feel really invested in the outcomes that we put out there that would ultimately impact my mom and my sisters and my nephews and nieces who still live in the neighborhood. And so there's a couple of strategies I would encourage folks in, people listed out, nonprofits, business, faith, academia, take advantage of. One is really, especially on my team, but I think there's other folks in government who really rely on this inside-outside strategy of, I'd encourage you to find your insider in government, who is your advocate, that you can coordinate with to develop those inside-outside strategies to advance. I know government's really opaque and hierarchical, and so you need someone on the inside to help you navigate that and really understand where the pressure points are. And so it's not for you to necessarily become an expert in government, though that could be helpful. But if you don't have the bandwidth or the time, it's really about finding your inside advocate that then you can coordinate with and strategize with for those long-term outcomes that you're working on. Second, boards and commissions. One of the reasons why our environmental justice policy got passed was a former advocate, the executive director of Urban Habitat, that was Julia Ellis. She was sitting on our PUC commission. She found that being a policymaker on these boards and commissions is another layer of democracy that you can participate in to really influence then this $1 billion budgets, policies and budgets. So boards and commissions, any of you find, Robert's Rules of Order is difficult, or just managing that world and culture of boards and commissions. Urban Habitat does have a Boards and Commissions Leadership Institute, and they've replicated this model across the country and Minnesota and other metropolitan areas to train folks from low-income communities of color to take on boards and commission roles so that folks who are most impacted by the issues are in positions of power and decision-making. And so, as another step to boards and commissions, in San Francisco, there's 101 boards, commissions, and committees. And so there's no lack of way for people to be involved in democracy by joining an advisory committee. I staff one of those, or actually multiple of them, for the SFPUC, and it's a fantastic way just to get to know and understand the issues, and again, be in a formal relationship with the agency to be able to provide recommendations back to the agency.
Yes, you can clap. That's totally allowed. Call and response is a beautiful thing. Darlene, of the many questions you got, what's something that's speaking to you right now?
Well, first of all, I just want to underscore, because I got a question about this, that equity and justice are in this work the way we are framing it, and that's why it's so important that we spend time building a shared vocabulary, because what people think of when they think of equity may not be justice, but the work that we're doing is framed exactly that way, that it's not equity if it's not justice. If it's not bringing about justice, then we're not doing equity work yet. We might be doing fake-quity. We might still be doing, all props to consultants in Seattle that came up with that. We might be doing something that is symbolic. We might be talking about it. We might be, toying with the idea. But if we're doing equity work in a meaningful way, we are focused on justice. So we have to learn that's what we mean. When we say equity, we mean justice. And justice is ascertained by looking at outcomes. We'll know when we have justice when our outcomes are just, okay? So that's that. Oh my gosh, there's so many here. Somebody wanted to know the staffing and budget for our department. There are 3 of us now. We have a budget that is approaching, we're about between $300,000 and $400,000, I think. About $400,000, which is budget dust in most jurisdictions. So I just want to say it's totally financially possible. It's not about the money in most places. Even in Oakland, it wasn't about the money. And Oakland's poor as a city compared to Seattle, for example. But it's about the political will to get it done. And this is when the community outside game, I think, is so important, because it was the outside activism in Oakland that made this department happen. And so I think that we just have to remember that's why the inside-outside strategies are important. There was a question to that end about how do we stay connected with community? How is the community connected to my department? Not so much to my department. I'm not doing a lot of externally facing work, but what I do is I do respond to the community, report outs and that sort of thing. And but because we're so small and we have so much work to do internally, I don't focus on that primarily at this point in time, because what I'm trying to do is get the city in good enough shape that we can work with the community collectively. I could get a strong working relationship with community pretty quickly because of my background and how we do the work and my focus on accountability, but that would not change the relationship of the community to the city. I have to begin to move the departments forward in their ability to have different kinds of relationships with the community before it will be meaningful. Otherwise, the community is just giving me feedback and they're telling me when I'm off track, and I can check in and get that information pretty quickly, but I want to hear the community telling the city that they are working with the departments on the work that they're doing, that they're implementing in a new and different way. That's my focus. So I'm accountable to community, but I don't spend a lot of time telling the community how to do its work or even doing a lot of community process so far. We're moving into a little bit more, because after having done the work for going on 3 years, we do want to have a summit, a convening of some kind at some time in the near future where we can bring more voices into telling us how we're doing, basically, and to organize that a little bit. But the Equity Indicator Report, the issuance of that, has provided some of that naturally, and that's really what we want to have happen. Not have this be about holding summits and convenings, but that our work itself connects us to the community and causes the conversations that need to happen in a naturalized way, because we're doing something different, as opposed to we're going to have an annual summit and then that's all there is to it. Do you get the difference? We have these summits and convenings and nothing changes. This is what the community tells me. Periodically we convene and we have a summit, but nothing in the city changes. So my job is to get the city ready to change. And then we can do more work with the community. And then we can change some more, because we're going to need to. That's enough for now.
So we unfortunately are past time. However, as I said earlier, we are welcoming folks to come up to us. We could go out to you to continue discussing these things. Just want to call on us to deepen our practice, and we're happy to talk more. Thank you so much for being here on behalf of Race Forward. We're just super glad to see you, see your beautiful faces, and look forward to meeting you at future conferences and convenings. Thanks, everybody.